I want to speak a little bit about the issue of Jingoism in China. There's a group on Facebook known as Shanghaiist, and what they do is they upload quirky, interesting stories from China. Some people have alleged it's run by Westerners, and given the sort of tones of the stories, that can be believable. I don't know, but they have some interesting reports about everyday life in China. Anyway, one just caught my attention, and it got me thinking about some other issues, related other issues. Strive to be good sons and daughters of China, read one red banner unfurled on campus by university authorities. Oppose kitsch foreign festivals. Stop Western culture from expanding, read another banner. This is Northwest University. Doesn't say which city that is in, but I'd imagine somewhere in northwest China. Anyway, there was another similar incident, let's say, development in Changsha, in Hunan province, where I was last year. In fact, the street they name is the very street that I visited, Taiping Street in Changsha, and it shows a group of students in traditional Han costumes, 3 girls and 2 guys apparently, and they're holding up red placards saying boycott Christmas, Chinese people should not celebrate foreign festivals. Okay, this sort of mentality is, I wouldn't say it's very common in China, but it's definitely apparent. This is obviously in response to the fact that there are a lot of Chinese who, if not necessarily celebrate Christmas, they certainly acknowledge it, and they certainly, I think in China Christmas is sort of an excuse for shopping, and they do put up Christmas trees and so on, so there has been something of an influence in terms of Christmas being celebrated there. But my reaction to this is resentment and little bit of irritation, because it's hypocritical. If you look at Western countries, there's a lot of evidence that Chinese culture is celebrated, whether that be in a wide variety of ways. Spring Festival is of course a big event in China, and it is celebrated in Western countries, not just in the Chinese community. It's, I think, increasingly becoming quite a big thing. Certainly I've been to a few events involving Spring Festival over the years. There's been long interest in the West in Chinese medicines, in Chinese philosophy, Chinese martial arts, of course Chinese food, even though it's not exactly the same as the real Chinese food, but nevertheless Chinese food. And of course Chinatowns, that's the epitome of Chinese culture in some ways. Big Chinatowns all over Western cities, San Francisco, London, Manchester, etc. Now, my own stance is that it enriches culture to have diversity in culture, and so long as cultures don't violate democratic principles such as freedom of expression or basic human rights, then I've no problem with them. I think it enriches a society to have a diverse range of cultures. So just to be clear, I've got no problem with Chinese culture in the West. But I do resent this jingoism that can occasionally be seen in China, and I think the Communist Party is guilty of fueling it. Now, maybe the students took it on themselves to do this, but as a foreigner who's been to China, I have to say I resent it. I wouldn't go so far as to use the word racism, but it's definitely jingoistic, and it yet again shows China is still in some ways a very close-minded country. I don't think it's as tolerant as Western countries insofar as culture is concerned. I think it has improved a lot. But one thing I find striking about that particular protest, and I'll put a link to it here, is that they're accusing the West of eroding Chinese culture, because they assume that Christmas is specifically Western culture, although arguably it's a Christian festival, relates to the Middle East. Actually, it could be arguably a pagan festival, but anyway, not to go off on a tangent. The point I'm making is they're blaming the West for that and foreigners, but they fail to recognise the fact that during the Cultural Revolution It was Mao and his Red Guards who done more than anybody to destroy Chinese culture. There was far more, I would argue, there's far more Chinese culture destroyed in the 1960s in the Cultural Revolution than even during all three Opium Wars combined. Now, I accept the Opium Wars were humiliation, they were morally wrong, but they were a very long time ago, and I suspect this jingoistic mindset is still related to that. And it's pathetic. It's pathetic that China, being arguably one of the most powerful countries in the world, still has this very childish mentality to foreigners. And I do believe it is encouraged by the Communist Party, and definitely by state media. Now, Xinhua's English version online is pretty moderate. They don't have anything particularly controversial in their English version, but in their Chinese language version, I would argue they're very jingoistic, and certainly they've shown that over the years. Chinese state media has often tried to scapegoat foreigners, and I think, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't think the situation in China is really bad, and I think most Chinese are open-minded, especially young Chinese. They do take an interest in other cultures. It varies though. I mean, I'm working with a group of students, and I might well get fired if my employers knew I was talking about this. But so I'll be quite vague about it. But my job involves working with international students from China, and a lot of them are from rich families. They're quite spoiled, so they're not very good at taking an interest in Western culture. But that can't be said of all overseas Chinese students. I mean, I've known many, and I would say that a lot of Chinese are open-minded, and they do take interest in other cultures. They take photographs, they ask questions, so it's not a universal thing. I just think it's unfortunate that there are quite a lot of people that do have that mentality. I mean, in the West, and I'm not saying this doesn't exist in the West, you do have Jingoism here as well, but the difference is, I think Western society generally is more tolerant of other cultures. Now, you could argue there's a different history, and the West hasn't had the same experience of feeling the impact of imperialism, but I still think that the Opium Wars are used as an excuse for everything in China. Now, I'm not saying what's happened with these students is, anything to do with the Opium Wars, but I'm just mentioning that because sometimes it is used as an excuse by some Chinese to justify their hostile attitude to foreigners, and I think that's pathetic because it was 170 years ago. If China's going to be the world's next superpower, then these sort of things matter. So I think these students need a history lesson, especially on their country's recent history and what Mao done to Chinese culture. And I also think they should be very careful about their hostility to Western culture if they ever want to study in a Western university, because then they can't take the attitude of being closed-minded. They're going to have to respect our culture. Most Western tourists who go to China go because they're interested in Chinese culture, and I think most of them are well behaved and respectful. So my reaction as a Westerner is resentment, because it's hypocritical and it's based on ignorance.